hunger for the subject is such that we want to broaden it to cover short courses, MBAs, you name it, because after all, without energy you don't really have too much. So I'm looking forward to a great debate this evening. I think that we've got a wonderful array of speakers. Thank you very much for being here.
Together with the team, we started to look at creating a center for management of energy. But this seminar is really about the United Nations Climate Change Conference that is taking place in Paris at the end of this year. Very important development, COP21. And the goal there is to make sure that we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to limit the global temperature increase to 2%. That's what's been set up.
The agreement has to be concluded to chart the way for the post-2020 period. Why the post-2020? It's because the current regime under which we negotiate, which is the Kyoto Protocol, will be coming to an end. And the Kyoto Protocol, by its nature, it's binding mostly to developed countries, whilst it's less binding to developing countries. Because as developing countries, including South Africa, will need to be provided with support so that we can be able to implement the programs that will assist in dealing with climate change challenge. So the Kyoto Protocol is ending in 2020. It had 2 commitment periods. The first one ended in 2012. The second commitment period started from 2013 and will be ending in 2020. So that's why we have to conclude the 2015 agreement so that it can kick in by 2020. But linked to that, which will be the focus of my presentation this evening, is what is called the intended national determined contribution, as the program director had indicated. Now, having outlined that brief background, let me then zoom into the presentation for the evening, which is on intended nationally determined contributions, abbreviated as INDC. The INDC for South Africa is having the following components. One is on mitigation, the other one on adaptation, but also there's an aspect of equity involved, but as well as support, because we still say we need to be supported. The reference point that the program director made to earlier, the Copenhagen pledge of 34 degrees emissions reduction by 2020, and by 2025 plateauing and so forth and so on, was reached in Copenhagen, right? So in terms of framing, we have used that as the basis for our NDC. Equity talks to you talked of the fact that energy drives, our economies. That means the byproduct of driving that economy is carbon. And if we look into our energy mix, which my colleague will talk, at length, where there's still a dominance, of coal. Yes, we are doing the best we can to try and transition, but we need to take into account equity. How much carbon space should we be afforded over a long time horizon? For instance,
so according to the latest greenhouse gas inventory, which was updated in 2014, I believe, it was estimated that the energy sector alone contributed more than 80% of total carbon emissions in the country in 2000. And a majority of these emissions were actually from the energy industry at about 63%. So this actually just shows the importance or the significance of the energy sector as a contributor to this, and also in terms of resolving the issues going forward. At the same time, as carbon intensive as South Africa is, in terms of total global emissions, it's estimated that South Africa only contributes about 2% towards total global emissions. So yes, internally we are very carbon intensive, but when you look at the global picture, we only contribute 2%. Now that does not mean it's an excuse for us not to do anything. I think the point that I'm trying to highlight, that it's important that negotiations that actually take place, such as COP, actually get global commitments. Otherwise, South Africa on its own, no matter what amount of effort and initiatives we take, we cannot put all these resources and put all concerted efforts to address the climate change issues without other countries actually also coming on board. So as part of the energy planning process, which is basically what has been embarked upon within the department to actually contribute to climate change reduction amongst other initiatives. We believe that there's various mechanisms that one can actually look at. The primary one that has actually been mentioned is basically means that you need to actually change your energy mix. You also need to look at other initiatives such as if you're going to emit the carbon, what do you actually do with it? How do you actually, what initiatives can you actually put in place to make sure that it doesn't have a negative impact on the environment?
Okay, so I think that climate change is a global economic and developmental issue. It is not an environmental issue. It has environmental consequences and has huge impacts on the environment, but fundamentally it is an economic and developmental issue. And it's also increasingly an issue that is very fundamentally linked to technology. And to the way that technology development is happening around the globe, and the potential opportunities and risks that creates. To carry on business as usual would have very detrimental consequences not only for our country but for the planet, and what do we do about it? At the core of the debate, I think, is that the modelling that informs that Copenhagen commitment was done in the early mid-2000s, very much at the height of the global economic boom. And it made a set of assumptions about economic growth and GDP that in this 2015 context don't hold true anymore. So if we look at it, we're using as a country less energy than we did in 2007. Our GDP growth is, if we're lucky, we're going to hit 1.5% this year. And so the question that then comes in is, how feasible is it under those kinds of circumstances? Firstly, how far have we actually gone simply because we've grown slower than we thought towards meeting those objectives? But then the big question is once we emerge, and hopefully we will emerge from the economic downturn, at some point in time, isn't the economy going to need to grow? And at that point in time, what is the energy mix going to be? And aren't we going to need to take the emissions that we haven't emitted over the last 5 or 7 years and be able to use them into the future to grow the economy? And so the debate between government and business over the last few years around this has really been about that issue. The negotiations used to be a solely government process. And what has also happened over the last 5 or 6 years is that there's been an increasing move, partly driven by the United Nations, but also driven by a set of stakeholders around the world to say, hey, this is our issue as well. It's not just for governments to sit in a room and make decisions, but these things affect us fundamentally. And so right around the world, there's been a very big attempt to mobilize a wide set of stakeholders across societies to support and get involved in the processes of the COP. And in that process, I think what's become clear is that business, is the main implementer. So if the private sector isn't on board, you can't achieve what we would want to achieve globally. And secondly, if the private sector isn't on board, you also aren't going to be able to finance it. The money isn't going to appear. And then thirdly, if the private sector isn't on board, you aren't going to get the technology innovation that you're going to really need to move the way our energy trajectory as a planet happens. And what has happened in the last couple of years is that there's been a very focused attempt to mobilize companies around the world to express their support for a positive outcome in this Paris process. The oil and gas industry internationally coming forward and saying we want a positive outcome. It's in our interests, I think, which has surprised many people. The investment industry internationally also saying we're going to look very carefully at where we are investing into the long term, and we want to, in the long run, have investment portfolios that are climate-friendly investment portfolios. In South Africa, we are way ahead in some ways, but I think that this debate about the nature of transition is something that we've barely begun to have if we really do want to achieve a low-carbon society.
And I want to argue that the business conflates the economic situation with their own interest, and that's fine. But I want to come back to. So I think from our point of view, from the press releases we've given, we think that there should be a clear, defined carbon budget up to 2050. We should try to work towards that. We should not delay this. We should try to bring it forward as much as we can. And we think we have some instruments in place already to be able to do that. It is also a conflict between those who want to hold to the status quo and those who want to try to create a new vision for a new type of economy. I think that's really what we're dealing with. And in a sense, the INDC reflects that tension. If you look at the development trajectory of South Africa, and if you look at the inequality that we have, you cannot make any argument that is reasonable to say that resource intensity and the current use of even fossil fuels has led to reducing inequality and poverty in the country. So this is a challenge that remains whether we deal with climate change or not. Even the people who argue for more fossil fuels need to find a way to resolve the current challenges we have in the economy. We do have to shift from consumption-based led economic growth that is dominating our economy in the present moment to think about new types of services that are tradable services, that we can sell our knowledge, our know-how, our technology, or whatever other ways in which we can create new types of exports that are less resource dependent.
Basically, the solution to energy in this country in terms of carbon is really that it's basically collective action. I mean, we've all got to be involved in it. And I think the interventions are what the country will do, the combination of government and the private sector. I think the enablement will be a combination of two, driven by enabling the environment for it to happen. But I think a lot of the implementation will be done by the private sector, because the capital will be brought in, the jobs will be created, and that's how it's going to happen. The beauty of it, though, is the private sector want to make money, and the government want to create jobs and address a climate issue. So there's a balance of, if you can create employment, we'll allow you to make money. That's the whole thing. As long as that we understand, we each have objectives and we come together in terms of understanding how we deliver on them. And that's the potential of the built environment at a residential level. If you think about it, we all live in homes, we all have a carbon footprint, we can all potentially sometime in the future get a certification around it. And then you'll see impact. Another question I start asking, why would you do it? The banks are vital to launch products in terms of making sure that you get a certified home. The estate agents love it. The property owners will like it because your home becomes more efficient, because it's energy efficient. There's a 20% energy saving, 20% water saving, and the intention is a 20% inbuilt energy. It's just in a building, it has inbuilt energy. That's the idea of getting the certification. And it's a very simple product or product rating to get.
The buzz is from a couple of organisations, Climate Action Tracker and from the World Resources Institute, that our INDC as a country is inadequate. It's below the world average, and I can give you the numbers later, I can send it to you. But so my question would be, assuming that the WRI and Climate Action Tracker are correct in what they're saying, what sort of pressure will that put on us at the negotiations?
So what I'm interested in is what is the possibility of a reconciliation, justice, carbon tax redistribution process in which business voluntarily, we mustn't have to force business, it's so boring to have to get business to actually do things that are in the interests of everyone, including themselves. How much voluntary capital, how much voluntary investment, how much voluntary technology is business going to put on the table in order for South Africa to meet our carbon commitments?
That is ambitious enough, because first of all we paint out, the context within which we operate, that we are faced with a number of challenges that are all known to us: unemployment, energy challenges, poverty issues. So we factor that in, and ours is one, like I said when I presented, that is one of those INDCs that has a component of adaptation, and the expectation is that the funding should be coming from developed country parties. I really wonder whose line, is Climate Action Tracker is towing. If you look at the projections, by some of the other studies, like the Chinese and the Indian studies, They project the potential carbon space for South Africa to be in the region of even 7 to 11 gigatons per capita to 2050. Now, if you project and factor in the population growth up to 2050, as well as economic growth to 2050, I don't know how far that could go, but it's way above what we have stated. And we believe that's ambitious enough. It's our contribution towards meeting the goal of 2 degrees, temperature goal. And we are committed. We are saying that provided that we get the necessary support, we may over time transition to even 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to us, this is ambitious.